When it comes to nature, wealth doesn't always guarantee safety. Sometimes it brings you closer to danger, and even the most cautious individuals aren't always spared from disaster. To truly grasp this, we must examine real-life incidents in which nature enthusiasts faced tragic consequences. Some were left to regret their choices, while others never had the chance. On February 5, 2025, the Black Tsar cut through the Pacific waters like a silent predator, its sleek black hull reflecting the golden hues of the sinking sun. The yacht, a floating palace of excess, was the pride of Viktor Volkov, a Russian billionaire, oil magnate, and power broker. It was more than a vessel, it was a statement, a testament to his dominance in a world that bent to the will of men like him. On board, luxury dripped from every surface. Velvet loungers sprawled across the deck. Crystal glasses clinked as the finest champagne was poured, and soft music blended with the rhythm of the waves. Victor had invited 6 of the most powerful business figures in his circle, men who controlled fortunes, who dictated the rise and fall of markets with a single phone call. His wife, Anastasia, was there too, draped in silk and gold, her beauty as carefully curated as the art lining the yacht's corridors. This was no ordinary getaway. Deals were being made, whispered over caviar and lobster, sealed with handshakes worth billions. The Galapagos Islands were far from prying eyes, from government oversight, and from those who might question what kind of agreements were forged in the middle of the ocean. Here, among the waves, Victor was untouchable. The waters were deceptively calm that evening. The sun cast long, molten reflections over the endless blue, the air thick with the scent of salt and wealth. Below the surface, unseen and ancient, something else moved. Suddenly, the first impact came. A deep, shuddering jolt rippled through the yacht's massive frame. Glassware toppled, and the chandeliers trembled. There was confusion for a moment. There was no storm or rocks, just open water. Then the second impact came, harder and more deliberate. The hull groaned under the force, metal twisting as something immense collided. From the depths, the great white shark emerged. 22 feet of raw prehistoric power, a predator older than empires, older than the very land the yacht's owners had conquered. Its eyes, black and empty, locked onto the ship with primal intent. It had found something unnatural in its domain that did not belong, and it attacked. The third strike was catastrophic. The yacht shook violently as the beast rammed its powerful body into the weakened hull. Below deck, seawater surged through the breached side, gushing into the lavish quarters and swallowing Persian rugs and antique furniture in its rising embrace. Alarms shrieked, lights flickered, and panic spread like wildfire. The yacht was sinking, fast. Victor barely had time to comprehend the disaster before chaos erupted around him. Crew members scrambled, slipping on the wet, tilting floors. Some fought to launch lifeboats, but the yacht's opulence had not accounted for true emergencies. The mechanisms jammed, useless against the rapid flooding. Then the screams began. The shark had not left. It circled beneath the wreckage, waiting. When the first body hit the water, a crewman thrown overboard by the violent tilt. It struck with terrifying precision. The ocean exploded in a spray of red. The scent of blood spread like an open invitation. Anastasia had been on the upper deck, her delicate fingers still clutching a golden railing when the ship pitched violently. She lost her grip, tumbling helplessly into the churning blackness below. Before she was gone, Victor saw her fall and the silk of her gown fan out like a pale flower against the dark water. She resurfaced once, gasping, her eyes wild with terror. Then from below, the monster rose. The impact was brutal. The shark struck her with its full weight, knocking her beneath the surface in an explosion of white foam and crimson. She did not come up again. Aboard the yacht, Victor fought for balance. His mind screamed for logic, for control. But there was none. There was only the gaping maw of the ocean, swallowing his empire whole. Investors, men who had built financial kingdoms, were now no more than flailing prey in a place where wealth meant nothing. One by one, they fell into the sea, some dragged by the sinking yacht, others thrown in desperation as they clung to anything that might keep them afloat. The shark attacked mercilessly. Another man was pulled under, the water boiling with movement as the predator thrashed. A limb surfaced briefly, a hand, fingers still curled as if trying to grasp something before vanishing. The yacht was nearly gone now. The nose lifted skyward as the stern plunged deeper, the elegant black hull disappearing beneath the waves. The last of the crew was either dead or lost. Victor knew he had to jump or be dragged down with it. The water was ice against his skin, shocking the breath from his lungs. He fought to stay afloat, his body instantly weighted by soaked clothes, his muscles burning with the effort. Nearby, the last survivor, A man whose name no longer mattered, clung to a broken piece of wreckage, his breath ragged, his eyes darting in frantic terror across the water's surface. The shark was still there, somewhere beneath them, waiting. The hours stretched into an eternity. The salt burned in Victor's wounds, his body bruised and battered from the wreck. The ocean rocked him like a cruel cradle, the silence more terrifying than the screams that had come before. The great white shark had stopped attacking, but it had not left. Somewhere in the depths it lingered, patient, knowing that exhaustion would claim what its teeth had not. When rescue arrived, it was not triumphant. The helicopter's searchlights swept the waves, finding only remnants. A dark stain spreading where lives had been, and a few scattered remains of a yacht that had once been a floating empire. They pulled Victor from the water, barely conscious, his mind somewhere between reality and nightmare. The other survivor, if he could still be called that, shivered violently, his eyes hollow, his breath coming in ragged, disbelieving gasps. 8 people had died. Anastasia, the investors, the crew, torn apart or swallowed by the sea. In the coming days, the headlines scream of tragedy, the billionaire's narrow escape, and the horror that had unfolded in those deep, uncharted waters. Experts discuss the behavior of sharks, the rarity of such an attack, and the merciless power of nature against human arrogance. But none of it would capture what Victor had seen, what he had felt, the knowledge that, for all his wealth and power, he had been reduced to something small and insignificant in the vast ocean. 2025, the Atlantic stretched endlessly around Jake Williams, a vast and restless thing beneath the gray winter sky. He moved with it, his paddle slicing through the frigid water, every stroke carrying him further into the open sea. It was January 17th, so the cold bit his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. Knowing their moods, currents, and dangers, he had kayaked these waters for years. Cape Cod's waters are alive today. Jake had spotted seals bobbing near the surface, their slick heads disappearing with quick darting dives. But what truly fascinated him were the whales. Humpbacks often made their presence known this time of year, rising like moving islands from the depths before vanishing again into the unseen world below. Jake had always respected them, those massive creatures that commanded the sea without even trying. He had been close to them before, close enough to feel the tremor of their movements through the water, close enough to hear their exhalations, deep and thunderous, but he had never been afraid of them until now. He had been paddling for over an hour when it happened. There was no warning, just the sudden shift of the ocean beneath him, the inexplicable movement of something massive stirring from below. Instinctively, he tightened his grip on the paddle, his body rigid as an immense shadow rose beneath him. The water churned. His kayak bucked violently as though caught in the hands of an unseen giant. Then everything tilted, the world blurred. The sky, the water, his kayak. One moment they were separate, and the next they all folded together in chaos. Something lifted him, something impossibly huge, a force that defied understanding. He was no longer in the water. He was airborne, thrown by a vast power that made his body feel weightless. Then darkness. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever known. 1 second, he was in the open air. The next, he was somewhere tight, confined, impossibly warm. The pressure was immediate, crushing from all sides. Salt water flooded his mouth, his nose burning his throat as he gasped in reflexive shock. He was moving, downward, deeper, swallowed by the darkness. His brain refused to accept what was happening. It couldn't. He had been kayaking, and now he was inside something alive. A living thing had taken him whole. Panic exploded through him. His arms flailed and his legs kicked, but the space around him was tight, slick, unyielding. The smell was overpowering, a suffocating mix of salt, decay, and something else, something primal. The realization struck like a bolt of ice, a whale, a humpback. It had surfaced directly beneath him, and in some freak accident he had been swallowed. The impossibility of it rattled through his mind, but there was no time to process, no time to think beyond the sheer instinct to survive. The pressure increased. He was being dragged downward, deeper into the belly of the beast. The water inside burned his eyes, and every breath was an agonizing struggle, the air thick with moisture, his lungs screaming for oxygen. He fought with everything he had. His hands struck out, pushing against the flesh surrounding him. His fingers found ridges, grooves, whale baleen maybe. Something solid, something not as smooth as the rest of the space enclosing him. He clawed at it, kicking, twisting, trying to wedge himself into any open space that might relieve the relentless pressure. His body was battered from all sides, the rhythmic contractions of the whale's throat threatening to force him further down. But he wasn't going to let that happen. He couldn't. He arched his back and fought against the crushing force, trying to keep himself in the upper cavity, where the air, if it could even be called that, was slightly more bearable. Seconds stretched into an eternity. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, and his mind teetered on the edge of panic, the darkness playing tricks on his senses. He had no idea how deep he was, how much time had passed, or whether he would ever see the surface again. His body was slowing, and exhaustion was creeping into his limbs. Just when his mind began to fracture under the weight of it, the movement changed. A lurch, a shudder. The walls around him flexed, tensed, and then convulsed. He felt it, the shift in pressure, and the muscles surrounding him coiled like a spring ready to snap. Then, in an instant, he was moving, upward, fast. The world exploded into light. Air, cold, glorious air. It seared his lungs as he sucked it in, his body half numb, his mind barely processing the fact that he was no longer inside the whale. He hit the water hard, tumbling into the sea like debris from a wreck. He was gasping, choking, salt burning his throat as he flailed on the surface. His limbs felt useless, drained of strength, every muscle trembling from the brutal struggle. He barely had time to register the massive shape retreating beneath him, the shadow sinking away into the deep as if none of it had ever happened. The world around him returned in fractured pieces. The sound of waves slapping against a hull, the cry of distant gulls, the rough voices of men shouting. He barely had time to react before strong hands grabbed him, yanked him from the water, and hauled him onto the deck of a fishing boat. The wood was rough beneath him, but it was solid and real. He collapsed onto it, coughing and shivering, his body racked with exhaustion and shock. They hovered over him, their faces blurred, their voices nothing but distant echoes. Someone wrapped something around his shoulders. A jacket? A blanket? He didn't know. His mind refused to focus on anything beyond the simple, staggering fact that he was alive. By the time he reached shore, the story had already spread. The fishermen who had pulled him from the water wasted no time sharing the incredible tale, and within hours, reporters were scrambling to confirm the impossible. Scientists, marine biologists, and oceanographers weighed in, each more astounded than the last. There were theories, speculation about how it had happened, why the whale had expelled him instead of swallowing him deeper. Some believed it had been an accident, that the whale had been lunging for fish and had taken him by mistake. Others suggested the creature had realized its error and, in some ancient instinctual way, had chosen to let him go. None of it mattered. Jake sat in a hospital bed, his body covered in deep bruises, his muscles aching from the fight of his life. His mind still reeled from the sheer impossibility of it all. He had spent a lifetime on the water, had seen its wonders and dangers, and had thought he understood its depths. But now he knew better. The morning of June 18, 2024, dawned bright and clear over the waters off Gansby, South Africa. The sky stretched cloudless above the horizon, the sun casting a sharp glare across the surface of the Atlantic. It was the perfect day for a cage diving excursion, the kind of conditions tour operators dreamed of. Calm seas, good visibility, and just enough anticipation in the air to make the experience thrilling for the dozen tourists aboard the Cage of Death. The boat, well-worn but sturdy, was designed for these expeditions. Tourists, some seasoned travelers, others first-time adventurers, had gathered for a chance to come face-to-face with the ocean's most feared predator, the great white shark. The crew had done this routine countless times before, setting out into the infamous waters of Shark Alley, where the cold Benguela current stirred life into the depths, attracting the giants of the deep. Sarah and Tom Walker stood near the rail, taking in the beauty of the ocean. They had come to South Africa for an adventure different from their usual vacations. The idea of being so close to a great white shark had excited them both, though there was also a nervous energy to it, natural given the circumstances. But no one on board had expected the horror that was about to unfold. The first few hours passed as expected. The bait was set, the cage lowered, and the first group of divers took their positions, watching in awe as a massive great white around 15 feet long ghosted through the water beneath them. It circled with quiet, deadly grace, drawn in by the scent of blood and fish oil used to lure it closer. Cameras clicked, adrenaline surged, and the tour guide narrated the experience with practiced enthusiasm. Then, something shifted. A deep silence seemed to settle over the water like the ocean had gone still. The shark's movements changed. Less of the casual curiosity they often exhibited, more tension in cutting through the water. Standing at the stern, one of the crew members noticed the change first. He glanced around uneasily, his instincts alerting him before his mind could process the cause. Then it happened. Without warning, A massive force struck the side of the cage of death, sending a tremor through the hull. The impact was brutal, far stronger than any normal shark bump. People staggered, gripping the railings as confusion spread through the group. A second impact followed, accompanied by a deep, guttural crack of splintering fiberglass. It was a shark, but not just any shark. This one was enormous, at least 20 feet long, and unlike the others, it was not interested in circling. It was attacking. The next strike was catastrophic. The boat lurched violently as the massive predator rammed into it with horrifying force, tearing a section of the hull apart. Water rushed in and screams filled the air, though no one had time to process their terror. The cage, still submerged, was yanked loose, dragging its occupants down momentarily before it surfaced again, twisted and useless. Then the worst happened. The boat, already listing, gave a final shudder before capsizing entirely. A moment later, tourists and crew were flung into the cold, merciless water. Panic exploded. Sarah hit the water hard, disoriented by the sudden plunge into darkness. The salt burned her eyes as she struggled to surface. Around her, the ocean was chaos, flailing limbs, gasping cries, the slap of waves against debris. But there was something worse beneath it all. The shark had not left. Tom surfaced nearby, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Sarah reached for him, but the water beneath him surged before she could close the distance. And then he was gone, dragged under in an instant without a chance to scream. Blood blossomed in the water. Sarah froze, unable to comprehend what she had just seen, but there was no time to process it. The shark wasn't done. The predator circled, emboldened by the frenzy, its powerful body slicing through the water with terrifying precision. Another tourist, a young man struggling to cling to a piece of wreckage, disappeared beneath the waves as the shark struck again. The water churned, red streaks tainting the pristine blue. People screamed, but it made no difference. No one could outswim a monster built for killing. The struggle was instinctive, clawing for anything that floated, trying to stay above the surface, praying the beast would lose interest. It didn't. Sarah found a piece of the broken hull and clung to it desperately, her muscles burning from the effort. The minutes stretched into an eternity as she drifted, barely able to keep herself afloat. Around her, the ocean was eerily still, save for the occasional sound of something thrashing beneath the surface. One by one, the voices faded. She didn't know how much time passed before she realized the shark was gone. The realization came slowly, her mind struggling to accept that the horror had finally ended. The ocean was quieter now, but the wreckage remained, floating remnants of the boat, lifeless bodies bobbing in the water. Sarah had no strength left to cry. She drifted, the sun now relentless against her salt-streaked skin. Only two other survivors were clinging to whatever they could find, too weak to speak. Hours passed before the rescue boats arrived, drawn by the distress signal sent before the attack. By then, the toll was clear. 5 dead, 3 survivors. The headlines called it an anomaly, a freak incident beyond anything seen before. Experts debated what had provoked the attack, analyzing the behavior of great whites and searching for an explanation. But no answer would bring back those who had been lost. For Sarah, there would never be an answer that made sense. On April 4, 2024, the waters of the Great Barrier Reef shimmered under the sun, a vast expanse of blues and greens stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The ocean was calm, and the gentle movement of the tide barely disturbed its surface. Sophie Clark adjusted her mask and took one last measured breath before descending. The water embraced her, cool and familiar, as she followed the rest of the dive group into the depths. She had been diving for years, exploring sites worldwide, but something about shipwrecks always fascinated her. They had a strange beauty, human history claimed by nature, rusting metal draped in coral and algae, the remains of something once mighty now surrendered to the sea. The wreck they had come to see lay in deeper waters, its skeletal structure broken and scattered across the seafloor. The group moved carefully, mindful of the fragile ecosystem and the occasional sharp edges of corroded metal. Fish weaved through the rusted beams, flashes of silver vanishing into the blue. Sophie kept a steady pace, her spear loosely gripped in her hand, hovering near the wreckage, scanning the water for anything unusual. For the first 30 minutes, everything was as expected. The divers explored, photographed, and signaled to one another with slow, practiced movements. Sunlight filtered through from above, illuminating the wreck with a dappled, ethereal glow. Its quiet beauty was peaceful, almost hypnotic. Then the reef went still. Sophie noticed it immediately. The smaller fish, which had been moving freely through the coral moments ago, had vanished. Once filled with the soft flicker of life, the water now seemed eerily empty. Even the current felt different. She turned instinctively, scanning the blue void behind her. There was nothing at first, just the endless water stretching into the unknown. But then, from the hazy distance, a shape emerged. It moved with slow, deliberate power, its massive body effortlessly cutting through the water. A tiger shark. With 16 feet of muscle and instinct, a predator evolved for nothing but survival. Its broad, striped form glided closer, the dark stripes along its body rippling with each movement. Sophie knew sharks. She had encountered plenty before. Black tips, white tips, reef sharks, even the occasional hammerhead. But this was different. This one wasn't passing through. It was hunting. The rest of the group saw it now, too. A ripple of unease passed through the divers as they hovered in place, watching the shark's movements. The shark circled once, slow and patient, as if assessing them. Then, without warning, it lunged. Sophie barely had time to react. One moment the shark was a few yards away, and the next it closed the distance with terrifying speed. She instinctively raised her spear, aiming for its snout, trying to deter it, but the shark was too fast and powerful. Its jaws clamped down on her arm. A shock of pain surged through her as teeth tore into flesh and muscle. The force was unimaginable, like being caught in a hydraulic press, the sheer pressure threatening to rip her limb from its socket. Blood clouded the water instantly, a deep red plume spiraling around them. The shark twisted, dragging her downward, its instincts triggered by the prey's resistance. Sophie fought. She struck at its eye, its gills, twisting her body in a desperate attempt to break free. But the shark had her, and it wasn't letting go. Above, the rest of the divers watched in frozen horror. The scene was chaos, bubbles exploding from panicked regulators, bodies scrambling backward, torn between the need to help and the primal terror of the predator. One diver fumbled for his knife, but they all knew how little that would matter against a shark of this size. Sophie's world had narrowed to the struggle. The crushing weight of the ocean pressed around her as the shark dragged her deeper. The wreck was above her now, a dark silhouette against the fractured light from the surface. She tried again to push the spear against the shark's head, but the angle was wrong, and her grip was weak. Blood loss was dulling her strength. The predator shook her, a brutal final movement that sent a fresh bolt of agony through her body. And then, suddenly, it let go. Her body went limp, weightless in the water. The shark circled again, watching, its instincts calculating whether she was still a threat, still worth the effort of another strike. The current carried her, her vision blurring as shock set in. The divers were moving now, kicking furiously toward her, reaching out, pulling her upward. They moved fast, too fast. The ascent was reckless, but they didn't have a choice. Blood in the water meant more danger. The shark wasn't the only hunter here. Sophie's breaths were shallow and uneven, the regulator slipping from her lips as she lost the ability to hold it. Hands gripped her tightly, dragging her toward the surface. The light was so close now, a shimmering barrier between life and the abyss below. Then they broke through. The boat was there, the crew already in motion, hauling her on board with urgent, frantic movements. The divers surfaced one by one, gasping, their eyes wild with the horror of what they had just witnessed. Sophie was alive, but only just. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the deck as someone pressed desperately against the wound. The shark had nearly taken her arm, leaving a ruin of torn flesh and exposed bone. Every breath came shallow and ragged, her body trembling from shock. The boat's engine roared to life, pushing toward the mainland at full speed. A mayday call had already gone out, but everyone knew time was against them. Sophie's vision flickered, the world around her fading in and out. The sky above was impossibly blue, too bright, too perfect for what had just happened beneath the waves. She knew she wasn't going to make it. The realization settled in slowly, like the tide pulling back from shore. There was no pain anymore, just an overwhelming exhaustion, a heaviness that made it harder and harder to hold on. The last thing she saw was the endless sky above her, the waves rocking the boat and the faint blurred faces of those around her. Then everything went still. The news spread quickly. Within hours, the diving community was shaken. Sophie Clark, an experienced diver, a woman who had spent her life in the ocean, had become its prey. Experts debated what had triggered the attack. Some say it was a case of mistaken identity, that the movement of the divers near the wreck had drawn in the shark. Others argued it had been deliberate, a true act of predation. But no theory would change what had happened. The Great Barrier Reef had claimed another life, and the sea, as always, remained indifferent. On July 8, 2022, the heat pressed down on the Florida coastline, turning the sand into a blistering surface that sent beachgoers rushing for relief in the cool, blue waters of the Atlantic. The beach was alive with movement, children shrieking with laughter as they splashed in the shallows, couples strolling along the shoreline, surfers waiting for the next good wave. Dave Matthews had seen it all before. As a lifeguard, he had spent countless hours scanning these waters, watching for rip currents, struggling swimmers, and the occasional reckless tourist pushing past the safe zones. His job was to keep order and be the silent guardian standing watch over a sea that could instantly turn hostile. That afternoon, the water was unusually clear, the sunlight penetrating deep, revealing the sandy bottom beneath. 100 yards beyond the designated safe zone, a family of 4 drifted lazily in the water. Heather Brooks floated on her back, her eyes closed against the sun, while her 2 children, a boy and a girl, took turns diving under, their laughter carried by the waves. Her husband stood waist-deep, keeping a casual watch on them, unaware that trouble was approaching from the depths. Dave saw them out there, farther than they should have been. He made a mental note to wave them back in soon, but nothing about their situation seemed urgent. He had pulled people in before, tourists who didn't realize how quickly the ocean could change, but the waters were calm. There was no immediate danger. Then something shifted. What became obvious was the easy flow of the water that seemed disturbed. The ocean, so welcoming moments ago, had taken on a new, heavier silence. Then he saw it. A dark shape emerged from the deep, just beyond the family. Moving with eerie grace, the great white shark cut through the water, its massive form barely making a ripple. Its body was nearly 16 feet long and a perfect machine of power and instinct. Its dark eyes locked onto the swimmers who unknowingly floated in its hunting grounds. Dave felt his stomach drop. He was already moving before he could process the full weight of what would happen. His whistle cut through the air, urgent and sharp, as he grabbed the rescue float and sprinted for the water. But it was too late. The attack happened with terrifying speed. One moment, Heather was floating peacefully, her body rising and falling with the gentle swell of the sea. The next, the water exploded around her. The shark struck from below, its jaws closing around her leg with devastating force. She barely had time to react before she was yanked beneath the surface, the ocean's stillness shattered by a violent, churning frenzy. Blood spread in thick, murky clouds, staining the blue water as her body twisted in the predator's grip. Her husband lunged toward her, but the shark pulled her deeper, its movement swift and mechanical. The children screamed, their voices lost in the chaos. Dave hit the water at full speed, his strokes powerful, his body cutting through the waves with practiced efficiency. He had seen shark attacks before, rare but never forgotten. He knew the odds, but instinct overpowered reason. Someone had to help. As he neared the struggle, the shark released Heather momentarily, its head tilting as if deciding whether to continue the attack. Her body floated limply for a second. Then she kicked weakly, trying to swim back up. The shark's decision came swiftly. It struck again. This time, the impact sent shockwaves through the water. Teeth tore through flesh and bone, the ocean swallowing her screams as she disappeared beneath the surface once more. Dave reached her husband first, who was treading water in stunned horror. The man was frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Dave pushed past him, focusing only on the spot Heather had gone under. Then, just as he reached for her, the shark turned. Its massive head swung toward him, its black eyes unreadable, soulless. And then it came. The power of the impact was unlike anything Dave had ever experienced. The force of the bite crushed into his torso, driving the air from his lungs as the shark's teeth ripped into his side. Pain erupted through his body, white-hot and unbearable. The world tilted as the water swallowed him, and for a moment all sound faded. His mind screamed at him to fight. His arms flailed, his hands striking the shark's gills and snout, anywhere he could reach. The beast shook him, dragging him deeper, its instincts primed for the kill. The ocean closed around him, muffling everything but the pounding of his own heart. The water churned with movement somewhere above. The remaining lifeguards rushed in, jet skis slicing through the waves and red buoys bobbing in the bloody water. Tourists on the beach were screaming, some pointing, some running. The Brooks children clung to their father, who desperately pulled them toward shore. Dave's vision blurred, his thoughts unraveling. He felt his body loosen, his strength ebbing away. Then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, the shark let go. He didn't know why. Maybe the rescue boats approaching had spooked it. It had lost interest. But Dave was no longer prey. His body, broken and bleeding, drifted in the water as the currents carried him away. Above, hands reached for Heather. Somehow she was still alive, though barely. The rescuers hauled her onto the boat, pressing against the torn remains of her leg, shouting for help. The beach had turned to chaos. Tourists were being pulled from the water, lifeguards frantically scanning for any more dangers lurking beneath the surface. The Brooks family was rushed to shore, the children sobbing, their father pale and trembling. The reality of what had just happened settled over the crowd like a suffocating weight. Dave never made it back. Hours later, his body was found a mile down the coast, washed up on a quiet stretch of sand. The tide had carried him far from where he had fought. The ocean had claimed him, but not before he had tried to save another. 2 lives were lost that day. Heather succumbed to her injuries in the hospital, her body too ravaged to recover. Her husband and children, though physically unharmed, would never forget what they had witnessed. And Dave became a name etched in sorrow, a lifeguard who had done what he had always sworn to do. The beach remained closed for days, and the water was eerily empty, as if the ocean were grieving. Eventually, the tourists returned, the laughter and splashing resumed, and life moved on. Only the lifeguards who had seen it happen still felt that day's weight. On February 2nd, 2025, the early morning sky over the Pacific was streaked with the first hints of daylight as the fishing boat Kaya bobbed gently off the coast of Fiji. The crew of 4 moved with routine efficiency, hauling in their nets as the sea lapped steadily against the hull. The ocean was calm, stretching endlessly in all directions. The men worked silently, their bodies accustomed to the strain of pulling in the heavy load, their hands rough from years at sea. The air smelled of salt and fish, a familiar scent that clung to their clothes and skin. Seabirds wheeled overhead, watching, waiting, knowing scraps would soon be tossed overboard. Below, the water was a shifting expanse of blues and greens, hiding the unseen world beneath. Then something changed. The first sign was subtle, just a strange stillness in the water. The natural rhythm of the sea felt disrupted, as though something large had entered the space beneath them. The crew barely noticed at first, too focused on their work, but the second sign was undeniable. A shadow moved beneath the boat. Long, sleek, and powerful, it passed just beneath the hull, its outline barely visible in the morning light. An 18-foot tiger shark, its presence a silent warning that went unheeded. The fishermen had seen sharks before, of course. They were a common sight in these waters, scavengers that trailed boats for an easy meal. But this one was different. It wasn't just circling, it was watching. Then, without warning, the impact came. A tremendous force struck the boat from below, sending a jolt through the wooden hull. The crew staggered, gripping whatever they could to keep from falling overboard. Confusion turned to alarm as a second impact followed, harder than the first. The wood groaned under the strain, a sickening crack splitting the air. The shark had rammed them. Water began to seep through the lower boards, spreading rapidly across the deck. The realization was instant and horrifying. The boat was taking on water fast. The crew scrambled, but there was no time for a plan. A third impact struck, this time with enough force to split the hull. The Kaya was going down, the ocean swallowed them whole. Thrown into the water, the fishermen surfaced gasping, their bodies disoriented by the sudden plunge. The wreckage of their boat bobbed in the churning sea, fragments of wood and gear scattered across the waves. But there was no time to think or process the shock of what had just happened. The shark was still there, and this time, it was hunting. A blur of movement beneath the surface, then a rush of water. The predator struck with terrifying speed. One of the crew barely had time to scream before he was gone, dragged under in an instant. The water churned red, the sea seeming to pulse with the violence of the attack. The remaining 3 men thrashed, desperate to stay afloat, their instincts screaming to escape the water, but there was nowhere to go. The wreckage provided little safety, and the open ocean stretched in every direction, an endless, indifferent void. The shark circled. Its movements were calculated and methodical, the slow arcs of a predator controlling the hunt. The fishermen kicked frantically, trying to reach whatever debris they could, but the tiger shark was patient. It had already tasted blood, and it was not leaving. Then it struck again. One of the men, struggling to climb onto a broken section of the boat, was the next to be taken. The attack was brutal. A surge of water, a flash of teeth, and then nothing. His body vanished beneath the waves, the ocean swallowing him just as it had the first. The last 2 survivors clung to what remained of the boat, their limbs burning with exhaustion, their minds numbed by terror. They knew the shark was still out there, its massive form gliding just below the surface. The minutes stretched into eternity, each second an unbearable wait for the next attack. And then it came again. The shark breached, its full weight crashing through the debris as it snapped at one of the men. A desperate struggle followed, a flurry of splashing, kicking, fighting, but it was futile. The ocean belonged to the predator, and the fisherman was gone within moments. The last man left, now the only survivor, floated in the carnage, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes darted across the water, searching for the shadow that had already taken his crew, his friends. He could still feel it watching him, circling, waiting, but the attack stopped. As suddenly as it had begun its assault, the shark drifted away. Whether satisfied with its kills or simply losing interest, it disappeared into the deep, leaving only silence in its wake. The survivor clung to the wreckage, his body weak, his mind teetering on the edge of shock. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, indifferent to the horror that had unfolded below it. The ocean, which had been a place of terror moments ago, was now calm again, as though nothing had ever happened. When the rescue boat arrived, drawn by the distress signal sent before the Kaya went down, they found only him. Blood-streaked, exhausted, barely conscious, but alive. The Fijian fishing community reeled at the news. An attack of this scale was nearly unheard of, a single tiger shark sinking a boat hunting down its crew with such precision. The ocean had always been dangerous, but this was something different. This was a reminder. A reminder that no matter how much man worked these waters, the sea would always belong to its true apex predators.